Hi, everybody. Welcome to Chapter 7 of Legal Environment of Business, where we're going to be talking about criminal law and cybercrime. When we talk about criminal law, we need to distinguish that from civil law. Criminal law generally or are situations where the state is the victim, where individuals or corporations are violating the laws against the state, as opposed to civil law, which involves disputes between private individuals, between businesses and individuals, and that sort of thing. Biggest difference between criminal law and civil law is that, generally speaking, in civil law, incarceration or the death penalty are not involved in those kinds of cases. When we look at breaking down criminal law into its component parts, crimes are generally based upon the seriousness of the offenses that are being committed, and again generally involve a wrong against society, as opposed to a wrong against another private individual. And then crimes are punishable by fines, incarceration, or death. The most serious crimes are known as felonies, and those are things that we think of such as robbery, murder, rape, and that kind of thing. And those are punishable by more than 1 year in prison and possibly the death sentence, given the severity of the crime. And then we have misdemeanors, which are less serious crimes. These are trespass, possession of drugs, minor assaults, and that sort of thing. And generally speaking, misdemeanors are punishable by up to 1 year in jail, and lower fines than felonies. For there to be a crime, regardless of what it is, you have to have at least two things. You have to have the requisite mental intent. In other words, do you intend to commit a crime? If I lay in wait getting ready to shoot somebody, I probably have the intent to commit first-degree murder. What if I get intoxicated at a bar and drive my car and crash it and injure somebody? There it was clearly not my intent to do that, but I acted in such a reckless or wanton way that intent could be inferred. So there has to be intent to commit a crime, and then there also has to be a criminal act. And again, that act may be either intentional or negligent. When we talk about criminal law, there is a higher burden of proof that the state must meet. In cases involving crimes, the state is required to prove the offense beyond a reasonable doubt. In civil cases, that burden of proof is what's known as clear, cogent, and convincing evidence, or sometimes preponderance of the evidence. Preponderance of the evidence means that something more likely than not happened. Clear, cogent, and convincing evidence means that it's enough evidence to instantly tilt the scale one way or another. And then reasonable doubt, or beyond a reasonable doubt, is not no doubt. It just simply means that the person who is determining the case, is really left with no other options for how this thing occurred. So it's a very high standard of proof. Not only can people be held criminally responsible for their actions, such as robbers and rapists and that kind of things, but there's corporate criminal liability as well. And a corporation can be criminally liable if an agent or employee of that corporation commits a criminal act within the scope of his or her employment, and the employer could have prevented the crime, or a supervisory employee authorized, requested, or recklessly tolerated the crime, or the corporation fails to perform specific duties imposed by law. So, in that latter case, if there's certain safety standards and the corporation willfully fails to abide by those, and somebody is hurt or injured or killed, criminal liability can lie in a case like that. Additionally, a corporate officer or director can be held criminally liable, one, for his or her own criminal acts, regardless of whether he committed them for his own benefit or the benefit of the corporation. Additionally, those can be responsible for crimes committed by those under his supervision in the course of their employment. Again, like many of the topics in this class, we could spend an entire semester just talking about criminal law. But again, I just want to hit some of the highlights for you in terms of what some typical crimes are that particularly come into play in the legal environment of business. There's robbery, which is the forceful taking of property of another without the consent of the owner. So, for example, if I walk up to somebody and threaten them with bodily harm, that's a forceful taking. If I point a gun or a knife at somebody, that's that's a forceful taking of their property. There's burglary, which is the unlawful entry into a building with the intent to commit a crime. So, for example, if I break into my neighbor's home with the idea of stealing their television set, I have committed a burglary. Then there's what's known as stealing, which is the wrongful taking of another's property with the intent to deprive them thereof. So if I'm walking in my office and see that one of my coworkers has gotten a new iPad and say, boy, that would be nice, and I just pick it up and walk away with it, that would be a stealing. There's what's known as arson, which is willfully building or burning a building owned by another, or in some cases oneself. We oftentimes see insurance fraud cases where somebody attempts to burn their own building down to collect the proceeds. That's a criminal act. Then there's receiving stolen property, which is where you possess property that you know to be or should have known to be stolen. So, for example, if somebody comes up to you and says, "Hey, I've got the Hope Diamond here, which is worth $10 million, and I'll sell it to you for $5," and then you give that guy $5, you should know that you can't get a $10 million diamond for $5. So, there's a reasonable chance there that you could be committing the crime of receiving stolen property. Another crime that we often see in the business context is forgery, and that's where somebody alters a document or a writing that changes the legal obligation of another. So if I forge a check to get money out of a bank, if I forge a deed to transfer property, I could be guilty of the crime of forgery. There's also a series of crime or criminal acts that are categorized as white-collar crimes because many times they take place in the context of business. And these include things like embezzlement, appropriating money or other property that one has been entrusted to handle. Many times we see like the treasurer of the company all of a sudden loading the briefcase up with money and heading south of the border. That can be a problem. In law, where I come from, one of the things that lawyers are required to do is keep trust accounts where they hold money and property for their clients. And many times, I shouldn't say many times, but sometimes you see the employee who is in charge of that account sort of helping themselves to it. So that could be embezzlement. Then there's bribery, which is unlawfully offering, giving, receiving, or soliciting money or other things of value in order to influence a public policy or action to gain an advantage. That kind of sounds like politics in general, if you look at our political system, but having said that, again, it's where somebody were to come up to you and, I'll give you $50,000 if you'll vote this way on this zoning regulation or something like that. Then there's what's known as bankruptcy fraud, and believe it or not, this crime we see quite a bit, where somebody has filed for the protection of the bankruptcy laws in order to keep the creditors off your back and so forth. And during the course of that, the debtor attempts to hide property or conceal property and things of that nature. That can be a criminal offense. Insider trading, which we seem to see a whole lot of in the 80s and 90s. Just remember the movies, Wall Street and The Wolf of Wall Street and those kinds of things. And that's where somebody attempts to buy or sell publicly traded securities. And they do so on the basis of information that they have received from somebody who has a confidential or fiduciary relationship with the company whose stock is being traded. So, by the way, you might want to unload, all of your shares of Amalgamated Frat because I've come to learn that we're going to get investigated by the SEC, that sort of thing. And then there's theft of trade secrets. And boy, I tell you, as technology develops, we see this becoming more and more of an issue. And that's where somebody steals or possesses trade secrets without consent of the owner. And we'll talk more about that as we go through the course. A fascinating area of criminal law involves organized crime, and of course you think about this, the Godfather movies and movies involving the Costa Nostra and gang-related activity and that kind of thing. But unfortunately, some legitimate businesses get caught up in this kind of tangentially, and because of RICO laws, the racketeering laws, they can find themselves in as much trouble as the people who are actually on the streets, selling drugs and running the rackets. And these kinds of things include stuff like money laundering, where an entity will falsely report income that has been obtained through criminal activity as income obtained through legitimate businesses. And sometimes we see banks and other businesses that are created for the sole purpose of kind of laundering criminal money, pass it through a quote unquote legitimate business, and then the money's been cleaned. That's a crime. RICO, which is the organized crime law, indicates that it's federal crime to use any income obtained from racketeering activities to purchase an interest in an enterprise. So, if you take a bunch of drug money and buy a bowling alley, that potentially is a violation of RICO. It's also against the law to acquire or maintain an interest in an enterprise through racketeering activity, to conduct or participate in the affairs of an enterprise through racketeering activity, or to conspire to do any of the foregoing. So, you look at, if you ever watch these shows on crime shows on TV, they always have a big chart on the wall, with all the faces and the businesses, and they're all linked and connected to each other. And the interesting thing about racketeering is that if you can convict a low-level person in the conspiracy because of the RICO laws, and if you can track that behavior or that money all the way to the top, somebody who's doing something way down below can get the top dog in trouble as well. So it's really a fascinating area of the law, which again, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to talk about. There are some defenses to criminal liability aside from just I didn't do it, and those include things like justifiable use of force or self-defense. If you're walking down the street and you come upon somebody attacking or assaulting another individual, or somebody tries to attack or assault you, you have the ability to defend yourself, obviously, and generally you can use the force necessary required to do that. We're seeing throughout the country the passage of a lot of things like castle laws and stand your ground laws, which attempt to clarify that. Essentially, if somebody comes, kicking in your front door, you have the ability to shoot them, regardless of, before you have to figure out what their intent is. The idea being that if somebody's kicking in your front door, they're not there to sell Girl Scout cookies. Stand your ground's a little more problematic, where it allows you to take a forceful action if you feel threatened. I think we'll see more case law about that. But again, to protect yourself, that would be a defense to criminal liability. Again, we talked about the idea that you have to have a mental state and to commit a crime. And again, if you suffer from some sort of mental illness or mental defect that interfered with your ability to understand right from wrong, or to help assist you in the legal system, that can be a defense. Mistake, again, ignorance of the law is not a defense. But if it's some really weird, obscure law that nobody would have any reason to know about, that might be a defense. Or if somebody relies on an official statement of the law that was incorrect, that can be a defense. Duress. If somebody comes to my home and kidnaps my family and says, you need to go to your bank where you work and take a bunch of money and bring it here, or I'm going to hurt your family, the reason that you're doing that is certainly a defense. So threatening harm or death to you or a family member in order to encourage you to commit a crime may be a defense. Entrapment is where the police basically get you to commit a crime that you wouldn't have committed but for the fact that they coerced you to do that. So, if the law comes up and tries to coerce you to buy drugs or that sort of thing, that can be a problem. There's also statute of limitations. Our law says that at some point in time, long enough is long enough. And most crimes, with the exception of the biggies, murder, rape, and that sort of thing, have statute of limitations, which means that the state has to bring the charges against you within a certain number of years. Failure to do that can result in them being prevented from doing that later. And then there's immunity. Oftentimes people make deals, to save their own skin, and so the state will basically, through contractual agreement, agree not to prosecute if you cooperate and that sort of thing. Again, the Constitution, which we talked about in Chapter 5, protects accused people. And again, that's one of the fundamental important things about our democracy and our system, is that we do have those due process protections. The Fourth Amendment protects people against unreasonable searches and seizures. And again, for the state to arrest us, for the state to search us, they either have to have a lawfully obtained court order, or the officer has to have actually observed us engaging in behavior which gives them probable cause to believe that a crime is being committed. Without those, the search would be unreasonable. The Fifth Amendment protects us against being forced to testify against ourselves, and again, that's the idea that the state has to prove our guilt. We don't have to prove our innocence. And then double jeopardy prevents the state from repeatedly trying us over and over and over again for the same crime. The state gets one crack at it. If they fail, then they can't, just keep going after us until we're worn down. The Sixth Amendment grants us a speedy public trial with the right to counsel and the right to confront witnesses. So, if the state charges you with a crime, they have to proceed in good pace. You have a right to an attorney, and in most cases, those trials need to be open and transparent. The Eighth Amendment prevents unreasonable bail. So, in other words, if you're arrested for a crime, again, remember that you're innocent until proven guilty. You should have a right to get out of jail on a reasonable basis until you're proven guilty. And so the state can't, just put gazillion dollars for bail. And it also prevents cruel and unusual punishment. And many times we've seen the death penalty argued as a cruel and unusual punishment, but all of those protections apply. A couple of constitutional corollaries that go along with this. The state has massive powers over us, the individual. And, if the state does, in fact, obtain evidence against us through an unlawful search or seizure or through an unlawful wiretap or that kind of thing, there's a rule called the exclusionary rule, which basically says that any evidence obtained in violation of our constitutional rights is excluded. In other words, if they find a block of pot in your backpack and they didn't have a reason to look in your backpack or reason to believe that you had that, then that pot would be excluded from evidence, and it would be very difficult for you to be convicted of possession if they can't put in the pot. Again, this is an extremely important rule because without it, the state doesn't really have a lot of incentive not to violate our civil liberties. So the exclusionary rule is very important. And then the Miranda rule, which is really not all that old if you think about it, basically says the state is required to tell us if we are taken into custody by them that we don't have to talk. The state has to tell us that we have a right against self-incrimination, that we have a right to a lawyer, and these things are required to be told to us before we give a statement. And if they fail to do that and we talk, that statement may well be excluded. Okay, there's a couple parts of the criminal process. There's pretrial, trial, and appeal. We talk about pretrial. Again, this is before somebody is charged with a crime. That person, if they're being arrested or taken into custody, it must be based upon probable cause. And that means that there's a substantial likelihood that a person has committed or is likely to commit a crime. If an arrest is based on probable cause or warrant, then generally that person is charged, and that can be through an indictment or an information. A grand jury may be convened to determine whether or not there's likelihood that a crime was committed, but the state in some fashion must charge that individual. Once that's done, then the case will be set for a trial. And again, the state must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of the crime that's charged. The defendant is not required to testify or prove that he's innocent. Failure of the defendant to present evidence cannot be construed against them as a sign of guilt. If the defendant is convicted by a judge or jury, he will then be sentenced, and that sentence will be subject to, in federal cases, the federal sentencing guidelines, which was created a number of years ago to come up with some sort of consistent way of sentencing people. In other words, people who commit the same crime should basically have the same sentences. But many times these have been challenged on constitutional rules or grounds for taking discretion away from the judges. But once convicted, an appropriate sentence will need to be imposed. All right, moving quickly into the issue of cyber crimes, and we'll talk more about this in our discussion questions and things of that nature. But the days of the guy in the mask and the bandana around their mouth walking up to you and sticking a gun in your side and taking your wallet, I guess that still occurs, but it's become much more sophisticated. And now that everybody is online and out there, evidenced by the fact that you're at your computer listening to me talk, there has been a significant increase in criminal behavior online, and so that's why we spend time talking about cyber crimes. Cyber fraud is using computers or the internet to deceive another to their detriment. So, think about all those spam emails you get. That those are people trying to commit cyber fraud. That Nigerian prince. I hate to tell you this, but they are not going to send you a big check if you send them a small check first. So cyber fraud is out there and proliferating. Identity theft's a huge issue, and again, that's the idea of stealing another person's identifying information in order to access that victim's financial resources or create a whole new identity for somebody to be able to get financial resources and then ruin somebody's credit in the meantime. And then, of course, we've all been subject to phishing and vishing, and that's where phishing is where somebody attempts to obtain information through email requests from a fake bank or similar entity. How many times have we received those things saying, you need to contact us, you need to get on here and tell us your password so we can confirm it's right. That's phishing. Vishing is similar to that, except the email usually requests that you call somebody to provide that information. And, the idea there is, I'm talking to a live person, and, so this must be legitimate. All I can tell you is that, particularly the elderly and vulnerable really are subject to this kind of stuff. So be careful. There's what's known as hacking, and that's where, criminals or others attempt to gain access to computerized information without permission. And again, in the business arena, we have seen some, major corporations get hacked and the financial information of their customers. And this can obviously be not only a significant financial problem for them, but goodwill and trust is compromised as well. And then there's cyber terrorism, which is the use of a computer to damage, alter, disrupt, or shut down, or threaten to damage, alter, disrupt, or shut down a critical computer system, such as the FAA, air traffic control, power grids, that kind of thing. And, again, what I would tell you about this is that these are ongoing developing issues. We hope that those who are in charge of these things are able to stay at least a step ahead of those who are trying to do, the government harm, trying to do business harm. But again, we see more and more intrusions, more and more sophisticated, and this is going to continue to be a major issue for us. One thing, the law often has trouble keeping up with changing technological times, and it seems like laws are always about 20 years behind the crimes that are going on, and this is no different when we talk about prosecuting cyber crimes, because again, many times the jurisdictional and venue issues that we don't have, if you're in Greene County, Missouri, and somebody walks up to you and sticks a gun in you and takes your money, well, that crime obviously occurred in Greene County, and the Greene County prosecutor can file a charge, and that person be charged in Greene County, and so forth. But what if your money is taken away by somebody in the Ukraine over the computer, or somebody in Boise, Idaho? There's just a lot of jurisdictional issues that are trying to be sorted out, and hopefully we'll have more unified codes and things like that, which will make prosecuting cyber crimes much more consistent, I guess. So I would just have you look at the text on this particular slide and be aware of that information. All right, well, that's a brief journey into the world of criminal law and cybercrime, and we will visit with you in our next chapter. Have a good day.